Welcome to this week's edition of the Weekly Draft Update, where we take 3 draft-eligible players. We're going to talk about the kind of football players they are. We're not going to do final verdicts. It's not time for complete evaluations because, first of all, there's still college football left. Of course, this is the last week. Actually, games are going to be starting in an hour, so we're going to try to get this done right now of regular season. Then we have the conference championships and then the playoffs and the bowl games, all that kind of stuff. We still have the pro days. We still have the combine. We still have the senior bowl, all that stuff. So these are not going to be a complete picture. I just kind of want to open up conversations and just kind of give my 2 cents on some of the football players. And of course, as anything, it's ever changing. I change my opinion on these guys every now and then. And as always, you guys feel free to reach out. I think 2 of the players that we're going to talk about today are really interesting conversations to have. The first one, Jeremiyah Love, not as much. I don't think he's as interesting of a conversation because you kind of watch the film. I don't think there's that much room for disagreement on how good of a football player Jeremiyah Love is. I think I haven't really seen too much across social media or wherever I get my draft information. Not too much difference of opinions regarding Jeremiyah Love, but talking about Kyle Lewis, the linebacker fit for Pitt, Jaishawn Barham, the edge rusher / linebacker for Michigan. 2 really interesting football players because we're not really sure where they're going to be playing position-wise at the next level, or at least I'm not. I look at both of them. They're both great football players. I'm just very interested to see on what people think they're going to be doing at the next level because I'm at a loss. I don't really know. We're going to talk about them when we get there. But as always, you guys feel free to reach out. Let me know how the show is. Any other players you want me to start focusing on. We're going to be doing 3 players a week, I think, until the national championship. And then we're going to kind of pivot the way we go about things. But we do underclassmen on this channel also. Last week, we talked about the underclassmen. Won't be able to do that for the next couple of weeks with signing day coming up. Going to be kind of cramped for time over the next 2 weeks. But yeah, as always, you guys feel free to reach out. We're also on a lot more podcast platforms now. So this will be on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify as well with the video, YouTube. If you're not watching, it's not because it's not out there. It's because I'm not doing a good job. But we'll talk about that. And we'll start with Jeremiyah Love, running back for Notre Dame, having a great season. He's already at 1,300 yards, 17 touchdowns as well. This last game against Syracuse, about as efficient as a rushing performance as you'll ever see. He finished with 171 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 8 rushes. Notre Dame ends up blowing out Syracuse 70-3, I think the final was. 70-7 or 73. They won by 60-plus points, which is difficult to do to an ACC team. I think that's difficult to do to an FCS team. I said this in the Jeremiyah Love breakdown that we did throughout the week. It's difficult to beat a football team by that many points. There's not that much time in a football game. It's not like baseball where there's 27 outs and then the game's over or whatever it is. There's a fixed amount of time you can score points. In Notre Dame, the defense did it. The offense did it. Jeremiyah Love, of course, did it, finishing with 3 touchdowns. So why is Jeremiyah Love such a highly regarded prospect as a running back? A lot of times you'll watch running backs in college and they'll be very productive and then they'll just not go early in the draft, or they'll kind of be afterthoughts. And sometimes it's because of the situation they're in. Usually their skill set, they say, won't translate to the next level, all that kind of stuff. So why is Jeremiyah Love not in that conversation? Why is this a guy that NFL teams should be excited about? It's all about the athleticism. We talk a lot about recruiting on this channel, and yeah, it's nice to see a guy that has good football IQ, all that kind of stuff, and that comes with time, and it's all down to the athleticism, the athletic traits that football players have, and the physical traits as well. So Jeremiyah Love's a really interesting football player to me because you look at him at 6'2", 215. He's really big. He's just always looked more like a receiver to me. This is a guy that I think at most schools, his build coming out of high school, if he ends up in most places, not Notre Dame, I think there really would have been a conversation about this dude playing wide receiver as well. He ran a 10.7 100-meter time in high school. I really like the fact that Notre Dame, obviously it worked out him being in the running back room, but now you got a running back that totally grew into his frame at 6', 215. He's a big running back. That's something that's going to get lost in the conversations right now. And, I think that, the Stephen A. Smiths, all these guys that don't really follow the draft, that just watch college football, that they're going to say, okay, Jeremiyah Love's a fast running back, just not that strong or whatever. He's really strong. We saw that against USC a couple weeks ago. At 215 pounds, he's really rocked up. You just don't really see it as much because he's kind of hard to touch in the first place because of how fast he is. That's what we saw against Syracuse this week. Like I said, 8 carries, 171 rushing yards, about as efficient as it gets. He was barely even touched. He sheds tackles so easily in the backfield. And I said this I've said this about him, and then as well as the Arizona State running back that had a really good week. Totally blanking on his name, Raheem. I'm blanking on it right now, but the Jeremiyah Love. Yeah, so it's like if you drew a straight line from number 4 for Notre Dame, Jeremiyah Love, into the end zone. If you could draw a straight line and there's nobody between him and the end zone, it's going to be a touchdown most times. And why? The reason is because of how fast he is, for sure. He gets there very fast, but I also think there's kind of a mental aspect to that speed. And you watch the other players, the safeties, everybody that's trying to track down Jeremiyah Love, that's trying to get an angle on him. You just cannot get an angle on Jeremiyah Love. It happened this week against Syracuse. The reason why he took home a lot of these touchdowns, he had 2 40-plus yard touchdowns, if I remember right, and then one was like a 10-yard. On the 2 really long ones, the safeties were in a position to make a play on him at the beginning of the play. The thing is they just took awful angles because he just kind of steps on the gas, and I don't think that these D-backs do a great job of really appreciating how fast Jeremiyah Love is. It's easy for me to come on here and say, oh, you got to know Jeremiyah Love is fast. Well, how fast? You watch the film. I just think it's such a different speed that he is on the field than versus when you watch it on the highlight tape. And that's what it looked like against Syracuse as well. I'm not saying that they didn't do their homework. They didn't watch the film. Of course they did. Of course Syracuse, they don't even watch just the film. Just watching national TV, this guy's highlights are on all the time. They're talking about how fast this dude is in a straight line. They appreciated how fast he was, but they couldn't appreciate it, I think, in full until they're actually trying to tackle him, is the point I'm trying to make. So why is this dude a draft prospect? It's not just the straight line speed, not just the explosiveness. That's why he's going to be coveted in the first round. But the reason he's going to go in the first round is because scouts are going to look at his frame, how strong of a football player he is at 215, and the change of direction ability as well. This is the thing with running backs is a lot of times you'll see them fast in a straight line, and if they have a lot of time to pick up the speed, you also need that change of direction ability. The ability to just change course. I think that's one of those traits that is it's non-negotiable for running backs, to me anyways. You can get away without the top flight without the top flight, but I think the change of direction ability Jeremiyah Love has makes him a pretty special running back, especially considering how fast he's in a straight line, all that kind of stuff. So any problems that I have with Jeremiyah Love, I really don't think that there's going to be that much derision on him when he's getting drafted. I think the one thing is he's kind of not underproduced as a receiver. It's just the offense that Notre Dame runs. They don't really get him involved as a pass catcher as much, and I think his skill set, how good of an athlete he is, I think that NFL teams are going to want to kind of incorporate him into the passing game a bit more than he's being used at Notre Dame right now. So I think the only question mark about Jeremiyah Love is going to be how does he kind of assume a bigger receiving role at the next level? How are his hands? We know the change of direction ability is great, like I said, but how is he as a route runner? They're kind of different things. I think there's a lot of athletes, especially receivers that we watch, they're really good movers. They can change direction really well with the ball in their hand, but that doesn't always immediately translate to route running. There's a bit more nuance to route running. So I think with Jeremiyah Love, I'm not saying we're going to be asking him to run double moves at the next level, that kind of stuff, but there's a million nuances that go into pass catching, and I think that the only thing that you're going to hear about Jeremiyah Love is he just doesn't have as much experience as some other guys, and is that a reason to not draft him? Hell no. Honestly, I think that's a reason to draft him, because you're going to talk about him, how good he is without having that skill set right now in college, or at least not having that skill set getting refined in college as much as some other guys. That's going to be the room for improvement at the next level, or I don't even want to say improvement, but the room for growth, we'll say, because I do think this guy's skill set makes, like I said, he looks like a receiver. Like I would have thought this dude was a slot receiver, the way that he moves coming out of high school, all that kind of stuff. But he's really developed into a running back. This is not just an athlete playing a running back. This is a great running back that just so happens to be a world-class athlete. Really just everything he does is so easy. And, that's my 6-minute glaze or 10-minute glaze on Jeremiyah Love right now. But I really don't think that there's going to be anybody. So, all right, where does he go in the draft? Because it is an interesting conversation because he plays running back. Is this guy worth a first-round pick? I'd say yeah. I definitely would. He's definitely going to go in the first round, I'll tell you that much. The question is how early in the first round, and the only reason there's a question about that, is because of how do you value the running back position, all that kind of stuff. So I think you have to view this guy not only as a running back because of the skill set. Like when Jahmyr Gibbs was drafted by the Lions, I was like, yeah, I understand people kind of saying, oh, this is an early pick for a team that, needs more than just a running back, or a team that had whatever amount of wins last year and he only plays running back. But Jahmyr Gibbs, not just a running back. You see the way that he's worked in the screen game, can split out as a wide receiver as well, just how great of an athlete he is. They're different players, I think, Jahmyr Gibbs and Jeremiyah Love, but both great athletes. I think Love's honestly a bit more rounded out than Jahmyr Gibbs was, at least frame-wise. I don't think Gibbs was 215 coming out of Alabama, but the point I'm trying to make is I don't think you can view these kind of players, these great running backs, as just running backs. I said Love doesn't have the experience as much as a receiver, but his skill set translates into passing catches. So I think he's going to be a guy that is not just a running back, but a weapon. I honestly wish we could start listing some of these guys instead of RB or wide receiver or tight end. Kenyon Sadiq, not just a tight end, he's a W. Jeremiyah Love is a W, just a weapon. Guy that you get the ball in, you get the ball in his hands, and he's going to do a lot of things with that. So I think that's my 2 cents on Jeremiyah Love. Don't think I said anything too controversial about him. Now, Kyle Lewis is a very different conversation because I think this guy is going to be, I don't know. I really don't know. He's a great football player right now. I don't know what his total tackle numbers are at this season, his entire stats this season, but this game against Georgia Tech, he was all over the field, finished with 11 tackles, 1 sack. Was a big reason why Haynes King wasn't able to get going on the ground and why Pitt ended up winning this game against Georgia Tech. Big reason was because Kyle Lewis was stalking him, and it wasn't always Kyle Lewis made the play in the backfield. It was a lot more of, Haynes King looked for a running lane, but he saw Kyle Lewis just stalking him down, and he couldn't. And then King had to get the ball out or do something else with it that he didn't want to do because Kyle Lewis was in a position to make a play on him. And what's really crazy about Kyle Lewis is he could do that and then get into the flat and make the tackle on the perimeter. So yeah, Kyle Lewis is another guy. Like, this is the thing is when we have conversations about guys and we're not sure what they're going to do at the next level, if we're not worried about the athleticism, I don't think those conversations really carry as much weight. Kyle Lewis is such a good athlete. He's going to go early regardless of how teams feel about him translating to the next level because you're kind of protected by that athleticism. If you draft a guy that's just a really smart linebacker but doesn't have those athletic traits, if you can't find a way to get him onto the field, you're going to get bitten in the ass. Kyle Lewis is a guy, day one, can be a special teams contributor if it's not going to be on the defense. But I think he's a much better prospect than that. So, we'll talk about Kyle Lewis. We got him listed at 6'1", 220. He plays kind of that nickelback position a lot for Pitt, so he's not just a inside linebacker. And I think that most people will say he's going to be a will linebacker at the next level. So we're going to have to – he's going to blitz a lot. He's going to be a good pass dropper as well. I think the question's just a bit more of like, what is that worth for a guy that's 6'1", 220, right? A bit undersized. And I think that Kyle Lewis in pass coverage is a great football player, and I think he's kind of the antidote to some of these bigger tight ends, these bigger slot receivers that you're kind of seeing move around the NFL. So I think Lewis is a great athlete and a guy at 220 pounds. He plays a lot of that nickelback position, like I said, where he's not in the box and he's guarding slot receivers. And I think he has the movements to match with them. I think this game against Miami this upcoming week is going to be a really telling of how good of an athlete Kyle Lewis is because he's going to have his hands full with Malachi Toney, that's for sure. I think that's what the matchup's going to be. We'll watch and report back next week. So the point I'm trying to make is I really like Kyle Lewis against those bigger tight ends, those kind of athletic freaks, the guys that they say are too big for D-backs to guard but too fast for linebackers to guard. I think Kyle Lewis is kind of the reverse of that. He's a matchup freak on the other end. He's big enough to guard tight ends at 220 pounds, and I think he's fast enough to guard good amount of slot receivers, with that athletic profile that he has. I think the one thing is at 6'1", it's like I really hope his arm length kind of measures a bit longer than he is tall because I'd really like Kyle Lewis to be 6'2", 6'3", but, at least he's not 6 foot, I guess. But really good football player, regardless. I hate the draft sometimes because it kind of turns conversations about great football players, great college football players, and we start kind of, being negative towards them. And I'm not trying to do that. I just think he's a bit more in the middle of the pack. So great blitzer as well. He had a sack this week against Georgia Tech. Not going to be coming off the edge a lot of times, but we see that quick trigger in pass coverage when he has to get to his mark first. He reads a run, and then that he can just kind of redirect and explode into his pass drop when he's blitzing. See that first step, that explosiveness as well. And trying to think, he had a couple pressures on Haynes King this week. Was just all over the football field. He finished with 11 tackles, but there were even more. Watching the actual film where he was just forcing the issue and just making the Georgia Tech offense very uncomfortable. I think he's the chess piece. I really do. Curious to hear other people's opinions on it because you can kind of tell I'm in the middle. I don't really know. Definitely a great football player, though. I mean, one of those guys, like, if you miss on him, if you don't have an answer day one, that's fine. He's such a good athlete that you could probably put him in a variety of positions and he'll be fine. Off-ball linebacker for sure. Probably not a Mike. That's all I'll say. In a four-man front, really like him as that will linebacker, a guy that's going to be blitzing and pass dropping a whole lot. Just kind of have to see how he is on the run reads on that other side, but I don't know. We'll see. We'll move on to Jaishawn Barham now, the edge rusher for Michigan. Another guy that's really interesting, kind of, I don't want to say positionless, but this was a guy that started off at Maryland. We're going to be talking about the Maryland game this week, where he finished with 4 tackles, 2 tackle for losses, also had a sack. Another guy that was in the backfield a whole lot of times. A guy that's also getting mocked in the first round. So all my reading that I've done, the research I've compiled, is this guy played a lot more of off-ball linebacker for Michigan last year, his first season at Michigan. He kind of looked lost, kind of hesitant on the run reads, all that kind of stuff. And they started moving him closer to the line of scrimmage as an edge rusher this year, and he's been really getting after the quarterback. He's got 4 sacks throughout this 2025 season, but the traits just kind of jump off. That first step is really good. He has a good ability to turn the corner, 6'3", 240, and I think a lot of things that I'm reading, Sharon Brown, what he talks about him, is just such a versatile football player, and that's kind of what NFL guys are excited about. And I think there's going to be such an interesting conversation with Jaishawn Barham because he's a guy that looks like a pass rusher, and people want to talk about him being kind of versatile as a linebacker, but I'm like, he got moved from linebacker at Michigan, at the college level, because he wasn't reading things fast enough. Things happen a lot faster at linebacker, or I'll say there's a lot more processing that has to go on at linebacker versus edge rusher, where you just can kind of line these guys up and let them play football when they're coming off the edge the way Jaishawn Barham is. Why would you kind of talk about him being versatile? He couldn't do it at Michigan, play that off-ball linebacker role. He's not going to be able to do it at the NFL. So I don't really think that's the conversation to be had with Barham. I think the conversation's a bit more is how good of a pass rusher he is. And I think it's all going to come down to how good his traits are. So I think this is a guy that the combine is going to really affect where he's drafted. I don't think Jeremiyah Love is even going to run the 40 at the combine. I don't really know that that much is going to change with Jeremiyah Love's draft stock from now until the actual draft, barring an injury, of course. But Jaishawn Barham's a guy that we have to be sold on the draft, on the traits, because he's not a great pass rusher right now. That's what I'm seeing. And why do I say he's not a great pass rusher? You can just tell he's new to the position, which is fine. I understand being excited about these guys' upsides. But, I mean, you look at a guy like Cassius Howell, David Bailey as well, just athletic freaks. They don't have that elite level length, kind of similar situation as Jaishawn Barham, but I think they're a lot faster off the ball than he is. I think they turn the corner a lot better than he is, and those two guys also have really good counters to that outside move. See that with Cassius Howell, the way that he can just kind of get offensive tackles uncomfortable by beating them to their outside shoulder so fast, so the offensive tackles start having to compensate to protect that outside shoulder, and then Cassius Howell has that athleticism to then go inside when they overcompensate to the outside. I don't think Jaishawn Barham's there yet. He has the upside to turn into that. I just think it's kind of like, how good are the traits? These guys are worth taking swings on to developing into elite pass rushers if they have the traits, to actually develop into them. So, kind of saw that with Shamar Stewart last year with Texas A&M. Didn't have that college production that you look for in a guy that gets drafted in the lottery in the NFL or in the first round in the NFL. But he did have those traits. He had that first step, that the ability to turn the corner, that kind of stuff. So Barham's a guy that's just not going to have that production going into the NFL just because he's very new to the position. So I think it's all going to come down to, how good is his first step? What are his vertical and his broad numbers? If he comes out and tests in the 80 percentile, I think I'll feel a lot better about Jaishawn Barham. And, I don't know. It's a very tough conversation. That's why I kind of wanted to open it up on here. Much more of a we'll see guy, I think, with him. I don't know if any of what I said makes sense. 6'3", 240 is it's like middle of the pack frame, and then he's new to the position. How good is that first step? Because I'd rather take a guy that has a bit worse of a first step if he's already getting at the quarterback at a high clip at the college level. Barham's having a great season, not trying to detract from it, but he's been a big part of that Michigan defense, moving from that off-ball position to the edge rushing position but at least this game against Maryland, I didn't see much besides him getting after the quarterback. He did a good job of that, and I do think he has the instincts to find the ball. A lot of times these edge rushers that do so good getting downfield, there's kind of a trade-off to that is if that first step's so good and they get so far upfield and the runs to the other side, they just don't find the ball. Barham just looks like he's played off-ball linebacker his entire career. The way that he can just kind of redirect and then find the ball in the backfield. That's how a lot of these tackle for losses happened in this Maryland game. I think that off-ball experience, a lot of people were just kind of, all the Michigan fans I read just didn't think he was a great off-ball linebacker last year. Anyways, that's what this episode is. You guys let me know what you think about these guys. A lot more conversations to be had. I'm going to watch a lot more film on Barham, and, maybe I'll watch the Ohio State game this week. They have a great offensive line, and maybe he gets 3 sacks on Julian Sayin this week, and then all of a sudden, I'm completely convinced of Jaishawn Barham's upside as a pass rusher, but, a lot more work to be done for sure. But we'll be back next week with 3 more players. You guys feel free to reach out any suggestions to get up, but I appreciate you guys for watching. Thank you.